Weinman. Mike.
Welcome, everyone.
Mike.
Nice to see a nice crowd for the start of the 2018 season of our Rancho Bernardo Historical Society Speaker Series. I'm Vincent Rossi, the coordinator of the Speaker Series program. Happy to welcome you to our museum. And before I introduce our today's speakers, I'll just mention that our next program, which will be February the 10th, Saturday, February the 10th, will feature Jennifer Grallman. Jennifer is a researcher at the History Office of the San Diego County Department of Parks and Recreation. And she will be talking about the new book she's co-written with another researcher, Ellen Sweet, called San Diego County Parks Over 100 Years, which traces the history of the county park system, which if any of you, as I have camped or hiked in the system, you know it's quite an extensive and an enjoyable system. It's also a historical one that includes old Spanish ranchos, an old stagecoach station, the remains of a grist mill, and a lot of other attractions which Jennifer will talk about in discussing her book. So we welcome you to come back to that presentation. Today's presentation, we have two fine speakers about the USS Midway Aircraft Carrier Museum, which is a proud ship that participated in history and now serves as a museum of history of naval aviation. Our speakers are Steve Walker and Brian Butler. They're both proud U.S. Navy veterans and active docents at the museum. And we are very happy to welcome them today. And without further ado, I ask you to please welcome Brian Butler and Steve Walker.
Good morning, everybody. I know many of you have been in Midway and you've got some knowledge of it, but our purpose here today is to really tell you a whole lot more. Okay, man.
I'm sorry, I mentioned the thing I've been reminded. Please ask everybody to put your phones on silence or.
Fair enough. Steve and I love questions, so please, as we go here, I know many of you have been in the Midway, and you may think you're Midway experts, and you've taken your grandchildren and your kids and your out-of-town guests. We're going to try to give you some details and things that perhaps you don't know. A little bit about me. I'm a Chicago guy. The Navy did give me a favor 50 years ago, this coming month. They sent me to some place called San Diego, California. And I literally had to look it up on a map and find out where it was in relation to Los Angeles. It was a day like today in February. And I drove in here and I said, you know what? I don't need to shovel snow. Just like all you folks who have come out. So I stayed here, went to school here, met my California girl, future wife here, and my kids were born here, and now like yours, probably they're long gone. They've gone someplace else. And Steve, I'm going to ask Steve when he comes up, talk a little bit about his naval background. So I was only in the Navy for 3 years. I never intended to stay, and I got out, and then when I retired about 3 years ago, this ship was pulling me, it was luring me to come down there, and I came aboard and I smelled that smell of only an aircraft carrier has. And they had me from below. And so being a docent is just an actual thrill for us. A little bit about us. We are a unique museum. Your Midway Museum is unique. It is run by the volunteers. There's a very small staff. There's 700 volunteers at the Midway, and that makes it unique. Those volunteers annually provide over 248,000 hours of volunteer time. So we don't get paid, but boy, we have all the bad Navy coffee we can drink. And we do. We have a motto, the docents do. Let's have fun today, and we do. The best part of it is interacting not only with you San Diegans, but people from not only every state in the Union, but virtually every country in the world. And that's been a surprise. We have people, Steve and I learned some words in Chinese because we have so many Chinese guests. So after I get hello and welcome and thank you, that's the end of my Chinese because it's very difficult to pronounce some of the words. Steve's going to, in detail, get into why the Midway, some of the numbers about the Midway success, but I'll just leave you with a couple here as we move forward. The Midway is now the most popular naval museum in the world, and there are many hundreds of those. But the even more surprising number is we are now the 5th most popular museum in the United States of America of 35,000 museums. And so why is that so popular? Well, let's do this. So again, please hold your questions, Steve. I'll let you go to the next slide. So here's what we are. We just added this mission statement. I'll just hit on a couple of words: preserving the legacy, inspire and educate, and most of all, entertain. I didn't think a docent was going to be an entertainer, but I've learned that we're entertainers as well as just being kind of like historians. So that's the mission statement. So we're going to do this in two parts. The first part one, is the Midway then and the Midway now. I'm going to do the then. So here's a historic photograph. This is September 10th, 1945, just about a week before or after World War II ended. Look at the clothing that people wore then. Here we are in Norfolk, Virginia, at the Midway's christening. Notice this configuration. I'm going to show you with the radical change that happened during the Midway during her life. And then Steve is going to do the now portion. So here we are in front of the Midway Museum entrance down below, right down on Broadway Pier, Navy Pier actually it's called, right down on Harbor Drive. For those of you who haven't been down there, we are right downtown in the waterfront. What a great view the guests get from there. And so, well, let's get to the little history portion. A lot of guests would say, well, why did they call the ship the Midway? And so, you know, for those of us, people that we have now in America, who have no knowledge of World War II, and not even a knowledge about the Vietnam War, this is Midway. 75 years ago this summer, we celebrated the actual, commemorated the actual Battle of Midway, fought just 6 months after Pearl Harbor in June of 1942, near some little speck of an island, halfway between San Francisco and Japan, Midway Island. The historical significance is that the United States Navy Air Corps, the United States Navy fighters, sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers within 2 days, and that virtually wiped out the Japanese capability to have air warfare. It took several more years, as you know, for the war to end. It was a very historic turning day. Most historians agree that the Battle of Midway, even though the war went on for 3 more years, was the turning point in World War II in the Pacific and the most decisive battle. 1943, the Navy decided, because of the significance of that, to name a ship after the battle. And they've done this in many times, in many ways. So here she is, off the coast of Virginia in September, October, about time frame. Look at the configuration of the ship. I want to draw your attention to that. Look at all the guns. I've got a pointer when I use it. Here's all the guns. Here's a gun tub up in the front. Look at these old tugboats. So here she is off of the coast of Virginia, and she was, when she was christened, for several years afterwards, the biggest ship in the world, 1,000 feet of aircraft carrier. She cost only $86 million to build. Imagine that. That's chump change today. The nuclear-powered carriers, the Nimitz-class carriers, are at least $4 billion today. And so, yeah, she was the first of 3 classes, 3 carriers in the Midway class, and they were also named, the other 2 was the FDR and the Coral City. So, after the war, so you got this aircraft carrier, what are you going to do with it? Well, war's over. So they did a couple of really interesting things. Operation Frostbite, yes, that's really snow on the flight deck. They took the carrier up into the Arctic Ocean to see how propeller-driven aircraft could handle very, very cold weather conditions. And this one is very interesting. Those of you who know your World War II history, look at this rocket. This is an old V-2 rocket that they captured from the Germans after World War II ended. They brought that back, and they said, what would happen if we had a mobile launching platform, an aircraft carrier, and launched a missile, a pretty large missile, as an aircraft carrier flight deck? Well, it didn't go all that well. In fact, what the story we hear is when it took off, it took a left-hand turn and just missed the island. So they decided maybe an aircraft carrier was probably not the best way to launch missiles, but the significance of this was that this was the dawn of the Navy missile program that went on from there. Next, please, Steve. So fleet operations, 1947 to 1953. Here's the first jet engine aircraft deployed against the jet aircraft deployed against on the Midway. That's the F-9 Panther folded wings, which are extended here. And here's what the Midway looked back in those days. In this time period, this was the time period of the Korean War. You folks remember that. So the Midway did not go to Korea. Why not? She went to the Mediterranean 7 times during this period of time. And the reason was, at that time, the thinking in the Pentagon was maybe the Korean invasion by the North Koreans and the Chinese was a feint. Maybe it was to get the United States assets there while they could have invaded Western Europe. So that was the thinking at that time. Well, of course, that never happened, but the Midway went to the Mediterranean instead, and now a lot of the other carriers did the same thing, just as a deterrent. So let's talk a little bit about the Midway's configuration. She went through quite a few facelifts. Here she is in her original configuration here, a World War II, what's called a straight back carrier. This is the way they did it. Planes landing from the back, they would stop by an arresting cable, and then the aircraft would come up here and launch. You couldn't do both at the same time. You had to do one or the other. They came up with the concept of the angled flight deck, and here she is in her first configuration. This is an 11-degree offset, so they could land these aircraft coming from the back of the ship, and if they wanted to, they could also launch aircraft off the front of the ship because of this configuration. But the other real major reason was safety. You've gone from these propeller-driven aircraft landing at maybe 90 knots. Steve, what would you think? 90 knots, 80, 90 knots, to instead aircraft landing at 130, 140, 150 knots. So it was a safety reason primarily. So the aircraft would land here, and if for some reason they didn't make that landing and missed a tail hook, they could go to full power, Steve will talk about this, and go off the angle deck. So that was the idea of this. But here she is after her second major facelift in 1970. She was actually out of commission and up at Alameda for 4 years during the Vietnam War between 66 and 70. They had other carriers, and they added these two elevators, this one starboard side forward, and this major one port side aft, to move aircraft up and down from the hangar deck. Look how much bigger it is. This is now, and this is the way she is today as a museum, 4.2 acres. So she has one of the biggest flight decks, I think, in aviation history. Okay, let's move on here. So here's the configuration look. Now look, here she is after she was christened. This is called the gun tub. And then when they reconfigured her, they added to the bridge structure, to the comparison, and they did what's called a hurricane bow. They didn't need these guns anymore because as technology moved on, ships did no longer need to defend themselves. Aircraft carriers did not need to defend themselves with guns. They had other ships and aircraft to defend the ship. So guns almost and totally went away. Here's her number. Here's her angle flight deck. Again, this is the 11-degree, the intermediate configuration. Next, please, Steve. So here's the Midway. She became a Pacific carrier about 1957, and the reason was, here's Taiwan there, and also called Formosa in those days. There was a belief that the Communist Chinese were going to invade Taiwan, so we started sending aircraft carriers to Japan. Here is Sasebo, which is a naval port. Here's Yokosuka, a naval port. So these ships were now stationed there, and they began to spend time in the South China Sea as a deterrent to what was perceived to be an invasion that also never happened. Midway really went to work here. She did 3 deployments to Vietnam. These are the typical aircraft that flew aboard the Midway. This is the F-4 Phantom. This is the A-6 bomber. She did 3 deployments to Vietnam. She was a very busy carrier in those days, as were all the aircraft carriers. So here's an area that's well known to me. I did 1 deployment as a 22-year-old sailor aboard a couple of other different aircraft carriers. Here we have the Gulf of Tonkin. This is known in Navy parlance as Yankee Station. Carriers would steam up and down around here. This island, by the way, Hainan Island, is owned by the Communist Chinese government. So the Navy very carefully but very aggressively flew missions here onto both North Vietnam up here, and then in those days what it was called Saigon, and now it's known as Ho Chi Minh City. This is the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, this area of the South China Sea, by the way, you should know this, the Chinese government now calls this whole area their territorial waters, and they're hoping the United States Navy will not go there anymore. Well, they do. The Navy still says no, that's international waters. So that's one of the things that goes on that you really don't read about. So we're going to talk, oh, wait a minute, thank you, Steve. So a couple of things that are important here. The Vietnam War was not an air war. There was not a lot of air combat as opposed to World War II. But the Midway has a distinction of shooting down the first and the last North Vietnamese aircraft during the Vietnam War in 1965. There were two first and two MiG kills, and then 72 was the last. Midway air crews flying off the Midway shot down 8 North Vietnamese aircraft during the Vietnam War. And then of course there were lots of others, but the Midway has the distinction of shooting down the first and the last. So here we have our look here at Yankee Station, Gulf of Tonkin. I remember at night being up here, and it wasn't that far away, and you would look out over the DMZ, which is right about here, and you would see these flares being dropped over the DMZ, where the real war was going on in the ground. There was Hue, 1968. There's a book, by the way, as an aside, that just came out called Hue, 1968. It's about that battle where those Vietnamese actually took over that city and held it for 3 weeks before the Marines and the Army was able to retake it. Okay, Steve, next please. So here we are. This is called the tip of the sword. Because of what was going in Southeast Asia, the United States Navy did something rather unique. In 1973, they decided to forward deploy or home port an aircraft carrier in Yokosuka, Japan. Yokosuka is about 50 miles south of Tokyo, and here's the Midway. She was the first carrier forward deployed. Now the people came and went, but the ship stayed there for 18 years. The Midway crews and their families, many of them lived right there in Yokosuka and forged a lifelong bond with the Japanese people. This is the carrier pier here in Yokosuka. Next, please. This is one of the historical moments. We all remember these moments in American history. This is one that some people don't remember. I remember this very well. This is April of 1975, the evacuation of Saigon. That was when we gave it up. We left. We had lost the war to the North Vietnamese, and the thousands of South Vietnamese literally fled for their lives with what they could carry. The Midway took aboard 5,000 refugees along with some other carriers, but the Midway took aboard 5,000 refugees during 2 days of operations. Many of the sailors on the ship gave up their bunks to let families stay together. As you all know, there are many Vietnamese who settled in San Diego, and think back to the 70s, there weren't that many Vietnamese people here, and now we have many Vietnamese Americans here in San Diego County, and we see them all every day. I really enjoy Vietnamese people because they're so darn happy, all of them, seems to me. Anyway, next, Steve. Okay, so a little sidebar of that is this. A lot of people, these Vietnamese people came out on these helicopters. There were so many helicopters, they pushed the helicopters overboard. There was no more room for helicopters, so they pushed them overboard, and they were gone because they had to land more helicopters. Well, this little aircraft, like what you would call a Piper Cub, it's called a Songbird, kept flying around the ship, and it wanted to land. They could tell, and they said, we can't land that airplane on our flight deck. The pilot comes over and he drops a message tied to a rock, and the message said in Vietnamese, have wife and 5 small children aboard, need to land on your aircraft carrier. So the Midway did what aircraft carriers do. Okay, that's what we'll do. They came into the wind in a driving rainstorm. Here comes this South Vietnamese Air Force pilot. This is the flag of South Vietnam there. And he makes a perfect landing on his little Piper Club, and out tumble his wife and 5 small children. The sidebar of that is 2 of the children end up being U.S. Air Force Academy cadets and becoming Air Force officers many years later. So they certainly, if they had landed in the ocean, these wheels would have flipped that airplane over, and those kids would not have survived. So that's one of the little sidebars that the Midway was very proud of. Later on, Midway was very prominent toward the very end of her career. Her final assignment, she was the first carrier to serve extensively in the Arabian Gulf, and she flew support missions over Iraq back and during Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield. Go ahead, Steve. And then one of her final missions was this, Operation Fiery Vigil. Maybe you remember this. The Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines in 1991. Midway sortied from Japan on 1 day's notice. It was a good thing she was there, and they steamed on down to off the coast of the Philippines, and they rescued 1,873 American dependents and military personnel. Here they are, sleeping on the hangar deck. This is the hangar deck in the Midway. So we accommodated those people, and they were eventually evacuated. Again, this is Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines that erupted. So let's see, Steve, I think that's me, huh?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to my buddy Steve Walker, my partner in crime, and if I don't mess this up, I'll be able to advance his slide.
Thanks, Brian. In the parlance of docent talk, Brian's a ship driver. He drove ships. I'm an airplane driver. Okay? Drive aircraft. Okay, that's just sort of the way we talk. But anyway, we've known each other for over 30 years. Our wives played women's tennis, very good. His wife's a scratch golfer here in one of the local areas here. So anyway, we've known each other for a long time. My background was ROTC and then flight school. And believe it or not, I was a setter on the squadron volleyball team, and I stayed as an instructor in Kingsville, Texas, during active duty. Handball got me to San Diego as another instructor, and I got out of the active duty and flew in the reserves for almost 16 years as an aggressor pilot. Has anybody seen the movie Top Gun? Okay, we all went through that school, but we were flying what Jester flew in there, that little called Mongoose A4, and I'll get to show you a similar aircraft here in just a second. And then I flew for Western Airlines, Delta Airlines, a company called NetJets. And right now, I substitute teach, and I teach online for Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And this is to keep my mind moving. But other than that, the museum started out in 1993, was a group that said, you know, we want to bring a good Navy carrier in shape to San Diego. And this group started to grow, but it was like an 11-year battle. People were worried about the Maritime Museum getting, thrashed because the Midway was there. People were worried about polluting the bay. They were worried about the environmental stuff, blocking the view. All these were answered, and one of the great things we do is that we allow people to come on the Midway at no charge if they want to go up to the bow. That front, we call it a gangplank, we call it a brow, that connects the pier to the aircraft carrier. You can go up there, no charge, go to the front of the ship, and walk literally over the water there in the protected area. So that is open to the public. So we've solved all those problems. And we spend over $1 million a year preserving the hull. And that's one of the biggest things, is you know how corrosive salt water can be. So that's one of the things that's killing the other aircraft carrier museums. Midway Magic, I want to put your eyes right on there, and Brian has touched this. But what I'm very proud of here, at 48,000 students, we have San Diego Unified School, and we have actually certified teachers with credentials that teach a 45-minute course. It's what they're learning in school, like their meteorology or some kind of science. We give them a lecture for 45 minutes, give them a couple of treats, and then we take them on the tour. And they do like a scavenger hunt. They've got to write down how fast does the F-14 Tomcat go, or what is the bosun's made, or what are the chains weigh, all that. And we bus them in. We have intercity school programs. We also do Sea Cadets. We have Midway simulators. They're non-motion, but they train them, and we give them all the learning so they can pass their private pilot's license while they're in high school. So it's a really good program. We have hands-on learning, all the different areas of the ship. They're taking barometer readings and learn a little bit about how the meteorologists work, construction projects. This happens to be an elevator, a weapons elevator, but they'll have a couple of things that they have to fill. So we're very proud of Midway University. That's exactly what we call it. We have classrooms that are all set up. They've got almost as nice as your PowerPoint, and they have these air-conditioned classrooms there. Make the next slide. All right, we're up on the flight deck now. We're looking back towards the city. Show you the Vigilante, the Panther, and the A3. But I want to fast your eyes, next slide, on the F-14 Tomcat. All aircraft have one of these little markers. That number is going to go away. We've got a new deal there. If you've got any questions on that, I'll show you. But it shows who made it, how fast it goes, what's the armament, and what was it used for. The F-14 Tomcat, as you know, was a fighter jet. It was air-to-air primarily. It was also to defend it. Next slide. We have mannequins that are exact outfit, if you will, what to wear when they go fly. These are not cowboy chaps, but they look like it. These are bladders that hook into a hose into the cockpit. that expand so that your blood doesn't rush from your head when you're loading up the airplane. These airplanes could probably handle about, you have 1 G or 1 gravity on you right now, they can handle up to about 7 or 8. My little A4 only was limited to 6, so you know it was a little older aircraft. This helmet and all the Nomex equipment, survival gear, and a torso harness that hooks them into the ejection seat. Next slide. All right, we have all sorts of airplanes. This is the A1 Skyraider, we call it the SPAD. It was still used in Vietnam, and there's a little historical note about this, the Midway. 2 of these SPAD aircraft, A1 Skyraiders, were supporting Marines in Vietnam, and all of a sudden this MiG-17 jet flew in and overshot them. And these guys had the presence of mind to ring their noses up, and they shot it down. The guy ejected it, but at least they took the airplane out of service, and they got credit for MiG. This is the first time that we've known that a propeller airplane shot down a jet. So that's sort of a neat thing. Back when Moses and I were in flight school, this was the first jet trainer, and this was the first aircraft that I landed on an aircraft carrier as a student. This is called a T2 Buckeye, and you can get in and actually sit in the cockpit here and get some pictures. So it's sort of a neat interactive. Next slide. All right, we tell you how we land. We call it a trap. The tail hook grabs the cable, and if we miss, like Brian said, we go around. So we come in on the back end of the ship. The Midway had 3 cables and also an emergency barricade. So every Navy jet, whether you're a propeller, turboprop, that E2 Hawkeye with a big satellite dome on it, or a jet, the nanosecond that the main wheels touch down, you go to full power. Even if you caught the cable, that cable's strong enough to hold you in the cable. And what I want to encourage you, because this is fairly new, we have video of a couple of interesting landings. Okay? Not only do you see it from the cockpit and also from the side where the landing signal officer in the back here grades every landing, but we have one of that Hawkeye, and I'm not going to be a spoiler alert because I want you to go see that. It's fascinating. They were an incredible crew. I'll have to tell you one thing. Cable breaks. Right in the middle of the rollout, and that's all I'm going to tell you. But we have docents that are actually there. We rotate in about every hour, and we talk about how we land, answer questions, whatever. And this is such a great upgrade. We used to have these flip charts that were pretty rugged. Next slide.